Hey, I'm Mike Handler. Welcome to the Child Discipleship Podcast by Awana, lasting faith in Jesus for every child. It's been a great season thus far, and today we are joined by Sam Luce. Sam, among many other things, is the director of childdiscipleship.com. Sam, it's great to have you with us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Sam, today we're going to be talking about a topic that you actually authored this part of Forming Faith. It's a fairly controversial subject, but we're going to not only just talk about the chapter itself, but we're going to talk a little bit about the idea behind it. Can you tell us the overarching idea before we get into things?
Yeah. So the overarching idea of this article that became a chapter actually was this idea that I think sometimes we get so focused on production quality in our ministries, the idea of everything being polished and everything being perfect, and trying to recreate like this Disney feeling for the church, that we forget the things that matter most, which is this relational connection. And this for us is such a big deal here at Awana. This is the belong thing. This is the belong part where we want kids to belong to a family and to belong to Christ. And the way that we model that is through these deep connections between kids and adults, and then ultimately, them with God. And sometimes what I'm afraid of is that we are so in our right desire to want kids to come, that we overproduce our services in such a way that it becomes this all of the feels but none of the truth, and none of that real relationship. So they come and they have an experience, but they don't meet Jesus. And so I think that's something that we really have to ask ourselves is, are we the kind of person that is putting on a show, or are we the kind of person that is helping them to see the beauty of Christ? And maybe even in the middle of a show, it's not, I wasn't anti-show. I'm just saying, hey, what is our motivation? What is the principle that is underneath all the things that we're doing?
So to that end, Sam, you talk about the fact that it's not an all or nothing type of thing. You're not advocating for, if I understand you correctly, hey, let's be zero fun and kind of all conviction and seriousness and all that other stuff. But you're what you're advocating for her is actually just finding the right balance of these things.
Right. Totally. I think since the book came out, I think some of the feedback I've gotten, positively from the people that feel like there's too much fun, and negatively from the people who feel like fun is essential, is they feel like this idea that the fun people feel like attacked or in some way, and or feel like I'm saying that it's not what fun isn't important, and then the people who say that I think we've gone too far feel justified. And I think that the problem is again, we look for this in everything in our culture. This is the problem, I think, broader, is that we look to where we are right and where someone else is wrong, rather than allow the gospel to address and challenge us where we're at, and to say that God is calling us to something much deeper and much more profound in how we interact and how we disciple kids. And so it should be completely relational and totally fun. And it should be the best of both. But I think the ditch that we have been in, I think has been in the Disney ditch. What I'm not advocating for is that we head to the Mr. Rogers ditch, that we become so unfun that we lose engagement with kids. Like the gospel should be completely engaging. And so what we need to be is to be totally personal, totally engaging, lots of fun, but totally true. And all the things that we're saying is that we shouldn't sacrifice truth for the sake of fun.
And maybe this is maybe this will only perpetuate kind of the polarization, perhaps. But just for the sake of the conversation, Sam, maybe you could help us kind of understand the extremes in that, because I do think, as you mentioned, we don't want to be necessarily stuck in the, as you call it, the Disney ditch. We don't want to also be stuck in the Mr. Rogers ditch. But in order for us to kind of understand that middle ground, maybe you could help us define or at least come to some sort of understanding of what those guardrails or what those extremes are, as a means to kind of help us find that balanced middle. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, kids Disney had something right. You know what I mean? He wanted to create this safe, clean environment where families could come together. He wanted to create this place where families could come together and they could have this really wonderful experience. He said all the other playground, all the different, not playgrounds, but the other um, entertainment parks that he had gone to before that were very dirty, were very unsafe. The rides weren't well maintained, and so an aspect where we have to think in terms of not just what do I need to get done to get the gospel proclaimed, but safety is a real thing. Like, how do we create a safe environment where kids can come and say, hey, I feel safe here and I want to come back because no one was picking on me, or I didn't feel worried, and parents can drop their kids and leave them and feel like they're going to be okay in their absence. And so it doesn't matter how profound your message is. If kids don't feel safe and parents don't think they're safe, they're not going to bring their kids, and they're not going to hear the message you have to preach. So it's important that it's fun and engaging, that they're engaged, that all their senses are engaged, that Jesus did this in his preaching. Is he used and he leveraged the life situation of the people he was talking to through stories that were meaningful to them. He didn't talk about these lofty ideas, which he could have. He talked about those lofty ideas in the containers of fish, of plants, of crop crops, and all these different things that made a lot of sense to them because that was in their context, and he engaged them. And his preaching was engaging because he demonstrated the power of God, but he also spoke the truth of God, and it was truth and grace in the context of love over time. That's how change happens in the life of kids and in the life of the people that we're called to disciple. And so it's not be super engaging. And I think this is the mistake that we made over the past several decades, is that it was all about theming your halls. It was all about trying to make everything look and feel and sound like Disney. And I think that was the mistake that we have to kind of course correct gently towards a more relational approach to kids ministry. It's not enough just to have thousands of kids coming if those kids aren't being engaged intentionally in a way that grows them to become more like Jesus as a result. You can have both, but the oftentimes is it's very hard for us to do both.
Hmm.
We typically veer towards the other one with gusto and become like either this really entertaining place for kids or this really relational place that isn't always super engaging. That
Yeah.
the teaching isn't engaging, the curriculum isn't engaging, and we're just teaching them real truths. We're teaching them systematic theology at an age when they need to know the basics of
Hmm.
Christianity, not the depths of Christianity quite yet.
Hmm. That's good. I think sometimes too, I mean, just to kind of give that other extreme, right? If we're so relational at times that new people, new kids can't find their way in, I mean, we're in danger at that point of just becoming cliquish, of becoming kind of a social club rather
Hmm.
than a transformational community founded on and diving into the word and the truth of God. And
No,
that's
it's
equally as harmful.
it's so true, and I think that's one of the things too. I think that the seeker sensitive movement, for all the things that it did wrong, I think that's one of the things it got right. Is it got us to think about not just about us who are here, who are these four people with our backs to the world in this little circle, growing in Christ likeness, but opened up to say, like, how are the people that are coming from our neighborhoods and from off the street into our doors, what do they feel like when they come?
Yeah.
Are we welcoming them in? And I think that's where the seeker sensitive movement got right. It made the church think about the people who are coming and who God wants to send to us. Are we preparing for them in a way that is faithful to what God has called us to do, to proclaim the gospel to all the world?
Yeah, very likely most of us have walked into a room where we don't feel like we necessarily belong, right? Where we
Hmm.
feel like we don't necessarily fit in. And that's a very alienating and lonely feeling. And we're not advocating to make
Hmm.
that the feeling for kids coming into our ministries or young people coming into our ministries. But we're also saying it's not all about, complete and total excellence and this kind of safe to a fault type of experience. Now,
Hmm.
I know you're not advocating to play like Chubby Bunny or whatever, but at the same time, if we look at the model of what Jesus did, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Jesus, there was joy there. I mean, he was basically running a youth group, and there had to be some sort of level of both authenticity in terms of the experience, as well as, you're with the Son of God. Like, they're deity made flesh in some regard. And there had to be kind of this balance, if you will, for these young men following him.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the problem, Mike, is that when we get so obsessed over excellence, right? When you go to a conference, sometimes, a lot of times the people that are speaking at the conference are people from larger churches, and they're saying all these really great things. And I've been there, and I've heard them, and I'm like, man, that is amazing. I wish I could do
Mm,
that. And what it does is that unintentionally, I think, discourages the people that they're trying to encourage, and it doesn't take into account the reality that our churches aren't factories; they're families. We're
mm,
not trying to build widgets; we're trying to create disciples. And this is, I think, where the Awana philosophy is so helpful. Is it talks about, we believe that what kids need is a loving, caring adult. They need to belong, right? We also believe at the exact same time is that they need to believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, which doesn't change, which doesn't need innovation. It's always true, is true, and always will be true, right? And those are the things that help them to become more like Christ as a result. And I think that's where the balance comes. Is it comes with the relational interactions with kids, but also the truth of the gospel in an engaging way that leads to transformation.
You mentioned that, Sam, and obviously, as somebody who also works at Awana, I firmly believe what you're saying. But if I'm putting on my outsider hat for a second, oftentimes in ministry, you're a ministry vet with almost 30 years in one location, one church. I was a pastor, a church planter. Um, we're responsible for metrics at
Hmm.
times for the being able to, at the worst case scenario, justify our
Yeah.
ministry, but at the best case scenario, in order to help secure additional funding and resources and all these things, because no church necessarily is independently wealthy doing every single thing they want to do.
Hmm.
That being said, as we talk about kind of this uh, paradigm, or rather this pendulum of excellence on one side, authenticity on the other, it's really easy to measure excellence.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's
It's
true.
it's really
It's
easy
true.
to kind of put that on a scale and to say, hey, we're doing this right, we're doing this right, we're doing this right. Are there helpful ways for us to think, not throwing Walt Disney under the bus, but are there maybe more helpful ways for us to consider or think about ministry from the standpoint of Fred Rogers and the things that made his neighborhood so appealing to young people who were growing up in that era, of which you and I would be of that crowd.
Hmm. Yeah, it is hard. It is hard. I think as a kids pastor, and I think that's part of the reason why that bent was towards there is it's hard, particularly in kids ministry, because it's you're planting seeds in the ground and you're not even getting sprouts. You're in the season of discipleship where you're watering and you're planting and there's only dirt. And that is discouraging for kids ministry leaders. That's confusing and sometimes frustrating for senior leaders, because so what we try to do is to try to create these metrics based on the amount of kids coming rather than who's missing, rather than what is God doing and how are we moving kids more towards Christ likeness. And I think that's the problem, is that we have focused on the wrong things. And it's not wrong to count how many kids are coming. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that so many churches and so many churches don't talk about this whole idea of what does Christ likeness look like? How do we measure Christ likeness in a person? And I don't think it's exactly scientific. I think it's a process by which day by day, year by year, month by month, decade by decade, kids grow in their ability to look more like Christ as a result. They like Dallas Willard said, that they naturally do what Jesus did. That's how you know what when someone has become more Christ-like, is when their natural decisions, when their intuitions don't become self-focused, but they become God-centered. And to measure that is not easy. It is not easy, and it's slow, and it's painful, and it's difficult. And I think this is why there's a lot of discouragement in kids ministry, because you don't see the hands go up necessarily or people's lives transformed in a moment like you would see sometimes in youth ministry or even in adult ministry. But in kids ministry, it's this faithful planting and watering and waiting and letting God make it grow. And I think that's where we have to be patient. And that's where we have to help our senior leaders. I think this is where we have to advocate for the slow work of discipleship. It's not it's not laziness. It's waiting on God to do what only God can do by doing certain things that we see in scripture that God calls us to do, to proclaim the gospel with clarity, to relationally connect with kids and their families, by measuring, by creating measurements, by how do we know that kids are more godly? Like how are they reacting, and how's the fruit of the spirit active and working in their life in a way that we can see? And this is, I think, maybe growing up in more charismatic churches, they're very focused on the gifts of the spirit,
Yeah.
and I think what we need to do as a church in general. And I wouldn't say that non-charismatic churches are any different. They just focus on different gifts of the Spirit. But I think what we need to do as church leaders and as kids pastors is help our senior leaders and help our leaders look for not the gifts of the Spirit, but the fruit of the Spirit. How do we measure the fruit of the Spirit in the life of a kid in a way that is compelling, is measurable, is that shows that this person is more like Christ as a result of the influence of the adults in their lives, as a result of the engaging environments and events that we put on? How do we help them? Are these things pointing towards Christ likeness? And what is the goal of the things we're trying to do? I think that's another thing, is so often we get involved in doing these events and doing these outreach type things without first asking ourselves, what are we trying to accomplish through this? And how do we know this is successful rather than just more people coming? How do we know that this is engaging kids in a meaningful way to be more like Christ as a result?
I think that's excellent, Sam. And I think that there is opportunity as well. I mean, just to kind of connect this to authenticity and excellence, if again, that is a pendulum that we're talking about, it's really hard to see the fruit within a child's life if we're not giving them opportunity to demonstrate that fruit.
Hmm.
Right. So
Yeah,
I
totally.
think about, the formational process that I went through, which was not scripted whatsoever. But a part of my discipleship journey as a child was I was enlisted to serve right away.
Hmm.
Like I was, we met in a gymatorium type of setting. So, if we wanted to play volleyball, we would take down the chairs. And when we were done, we had to set it up for Sunday,
Hmm.
Sunday morning or Sunday evening, depending on what side of the service we were on. And oftentimes when we're so, as a church or churches, so enamored with excellence,
Yeah.
we oftentimes don't give kids the latitude or leeway to serve because we're looking for perfection and not participation.
Hmm. That's such a good point. No, that's such a good point. And when you entrust kids to do that, they're not going to be able to grow into the thing that we're looking for. They're just when they start, it's not going to be good. It's really not going to be good. It's actually going to be less helpful than more helpful. But that's how they grow in their ability and their capacity in any ability, whether it's serving or whether it's praying or whether it's preaching. It's the first time all of us preached, it was not great.
Yeah,
And we needed to grow in that gift that God gave us. And excellence is a byproduct of relational accountability over time.
yeah,
And so you need to have a relationship. You need to have accountability. You need to have input. You need to have someone go alongside you saying, "Hey, here's what you did great. Here's what you need to work on." And if you don't have that, you're going to create this elite force of six people that do all the work, that burn out and burn up.
yeah,
And that's the problem, I think, and so often in the church, is that we've reduced. We don't believe in the we don't believe in the in Luther's idea, that the priesthood of all believers. What we're doing is we believe in this elite Christianity of some believers rather than the priesthood of all believers, and so we're not engaging everyone. And this is the problem with excellence. Like when you look at Disney, like what they do, like how they have these underground tunnels and people popping up places and there's no trash anywhere and gum doesn't exist and everything's painted 4 times. Like it creates this burden, I think, of appearance over like what we're talking about is this sometimes awkward reality of authenticity that comes from our church being a family. When your church is a family, it's not going to be great every time, and
Yeah.
sometimes it will be great, but it doesn't mean we don't be excellent. It means that we're a family first before everything else. We're a family. And that means there's going to be mistakes and we have to forgive each other and we have to love each other and we have to say, well, you know what? That wasn't a home run this Sunday. We didn't win the Super Bowl. Every Sunday's the Super Bowl. We didn't win the Super Bowl this week. And so we're going to, but that's okay because we grew in godliness and love for each other and forgiveness. And we addressed issues that needed to be addressed.
And not winning the Super Bowl doesn't make the New England Patriots no less of an NFL team, right? Like they're still
No.
in the NFL, they're still playing the game. And I think,
Yeah.
Sam, to your point before, I mean, it's hard to develop excellence without first being entrusted, right? Like
Mhm.
if you're never welcomed into the effort, you'll never develop excellence. And
Mhm.
I just think about how many children and young people we're robbing from developing, I mean, at the very least developing skills, but like developing Christ likeness because they've never been welcomed in to participate
Mhm.
as somebody who can bring something to the table because we're more concerned perhaps about the lighting and special effects, which are awesome, and I'm not saying
Mhm.
anything against those things, but like what would it be like to have that lighting board and to have a 9-year-old who's super interested in technology just be there, even just watching, understanding, like learning about these types of things? How
Right.
transformational would that be? Not just for that church, but that child as well.
No, totally. And I think that the part of the problem, Mike, with that is that when overnight excellence is our goal, we want excellence at all costs. What happens is that we circumnavigate the process that excellence is supposed to create. This process of going from, like you're talking about, like this child who doesn't know how to put chairs away, to being a someone who can preach or who can run the soundboard or lead worship. That process is discipleship. It's these steps that lead us towards, I'm going to entrust you with a little, and then I'm going to see how you respond. And that's what Jesus did. He says, that those he entrusted people. There's how many parables did it talk about, like with talents, and where people were entrusted with a gift and how they employed it, is pointing towards we're responsible for what we've been given, but we're also, as
Mhm.
leaders, we're also responsible for how we develop those people that God's entrusted in our care. That we need a pathway. So if you want excellence, you can have it, but the right way, I believe, is over time. It takes time to develop people in such a way that they have the character and they have the ability. But when all we want is excellence, what happens is oftentimes we go for ability over character, and the church suffers as a result.
Well, I think too, some of this has to do with our framing of biblical narratives. And what I mean by that is, I hate failure. Like I do not like to fail.
Mhm.
I've got a lot of friends like yourself, Sam, who do these awesome things. They try hobbies. They're like, all this stuff. It's actually a goal of mine to expect failure. So I'm working through that myself. But man, it's really tempting to read through, especially the gospel narratives, and to see people like Peter
Mhm.
or later on, to know the disagreements that happened between Paul and like, Barnabas, or Paul and I believe it was John Mark,
Mhm.
where we look at these as abject failures, and yet they're not failures. They're actually opportunities of formation in these lives of these young people. Like any one of us would look at those kind of accounts of Peter and just be like, the dude's reckless.
Yeah,
Like he's
yes.
just like he's a hothead.
It's a liability.
Yeah, like this do not entrust the mic to
Yeah.
Peter on outreach night. And yet this is what Jesus's plan was. He develops Peter.
Mhm.
It's through his failures that he's actually formed. And I guess the
Yeah.
question I would have for you, with the years of experience you have and the just familiarity with, others within the child disciple children's ministry realm, is Are we doing a good enough job allowing failures to be formative experiences, or do we just classify them as like another reason why that person can't do a thing?
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. And even just hearing you, I feel convicted too as well. Like honestly, I think so often we have this mark, and when we fail to do it, we have meetings to talk about where did we, after action meetings, and we talk about, okay, here's where this person failed, here's where that person failed, because the goal is excellence and not Christ-likeness. And in Christ-likeness, say, hey, here's where we can grow in our ability to reach people. Here's why we do what we do. And when excellence is the goal, instead of discipleship, instead of formation, instead of all these things, what happens is that we will we will create these wonderful events, but it will be at the expense of exactly what you're talking about, the learning from the failures. I've learned way more about the grace of God from my failures than I have from my successes. I've learned way more about my need for mercy from my failures than I have from my successes. And if anyone's who's listening to this would stop for a second, and I would challenge you to do that, stop, pause it for a second, and think about all the ways and the seasons in which you grew in your Christ likeness. It was through difficulties, it was through sorrows, it was through losses, it was through failure. And see, that's what the gospel does. Is the gospel says that you're not enough, but Jesus is, and he loves you because he loves you, not because you're good, but because you're his. And what he does is he comes in and he equips you and strengthens you. And he does exactly what he did for Peter to you. Because in the story of Peter, you see the recklessness and the craziness and the insanity of the person that is Peter. That is you. That is me. And what it reminds us is that we have great hope. And the kids that we lead, the kids that you would least expect, this is what I found. The kids I would least expect are sometimes the ones that surprise you the most, because those are the ones that God uses. It's not Oftentimes it's not the person who's the most gifted and the most polished, because oftentimes they're very focused on performance, on themselves, and thinking that they've achieved what they have because of their hard work instead of God's good grace.
That's so good, and it is so convicting because it's really easy at times to
Mhm.
just say, okay, you're the starter in this regard. Like you're going in, everybody else is riding the bench, to kind of use a sports analogy there. But at
Yeah.
the same time, it's those Jesus has a plan for each and every child in our ministries,
Hmm.
in our congregations, in our communities, and maybe the reason why some aren't flourishing is because we've not given them the ability to fail. Linking this back to the original kind of premise, because we're so much more focused on excellence than authenticity. And I love what you said in the beginning, Sam, is church is a family, it's not a factory, right? We're not just mass producing, perfection. We're in the formation business. We're in the discipleship business, and that's a messy, slow, agriculturally based,
Hmm.
crops, seasonality, all of that comes into play there, and it doesn't happen necessarily on a schedule or on a brief timeline. Um, as we keep going here, Sam, I just want to ask you, a couple more things as it relates to kind of this particular line of thought. Where are some practical areas that we can begin to welcome kids into kind of authentic service or authentic ways in which they can start living out their faith without expecting, no mistakes or without expecting perfection per se?
I think it starts with adults knowing kids, like getting to know them, hearing their hearts, and listening to who they are, and talking with them in meaningful and appropriate ways, and learning who they are, and how God formed them, and how he's uniquely gifted them. And then from there saying, hey, you know what you'd really be great at? Why don't you try doing this? And hey, can bring them by bringing them alongside. Hey, can you help me hand out these hand out these things at the front door? And hey, can you help me do this? And you find out how God's formed them. You invite them alongside you into the work that God's called you to do, always in appropriate ways. And I think that's super, in this culture that we live in, it's really important that the way that we interact with kids is totally appropriate, that we are talking with them in a room full of other people, that we invite them into ministry in an open setting, and that we make sure that we're totally transparent in our interactions with kids, but that we invite them into what we feel like God's calling them to do. Part of the idea of calling, right? When you look at scripture, it's some of the way that people are called is by this God-given gift that's inside a kid. But part of it is people around them noticing,
Yeah.
leaders noticing, and something about them. And oftentimes when you look at the New Testament, the way that people were sent out was not by them saying, "Hey, this is what I want to do." It's by the leaders in their life recognizing what God was already doing and inviting them to be involved in what God was already doing in their life and saying, "Hey, we see this in your life." And I think as leaders, this is what we're practically called to do, is not just inform kids' minds, not just warm their hearts, but also to direct their steps
Yeah.
in a way that God has called us to by the grace that he's given us. As a leader, part of your responsibility is to say, "Hey, this is what I see in you. And I could be wrong, but here's how I see that God's gifting you in this particular way. I notice when you do this, your eyes light up. I notice when you do this, everybody in the room, like just is so captivated." So I think God has uniquely gifted you in this way. And that's part of leadership, is not just doing things yourself, not just developing kids in a particular way, but by identifying the way that God has uniquely gifted kids and people in your team and pointing them in that direction to say, here's where I think that you can really flourish. You should do more of this. And then making way for them to do it,
Mm.
creating opportunities, like you're saying, to fail, to say, and then talk to them afterwards. Say, "Hey, I remember our youth pastor, when he first started preaching, his first message was really bad. It was really bad. We sat down and we would talk through it, and we'd say, "Hey, here's where you don't do you know, he did like a 15-minute story about how he got diarrhea from a burrito, right?" And then it had nothing to do with his sermon at all. And so we sat down and talked about that. So, how does that work? And so then we would meet, instead of me just saying, "Don't do that again." I said, "You know what? Let's just start meeting. Give me your notes and we'll start meeting and we'll walk through it. Here's how you do this. Because I think you really have a gift to connect with people. Let me help you figure out how to connect with people, but then also how to connect them with scripture." And so then we'd meet for like a couple hours every single week to go through his notes, chop them up, put them together. And I would give him tools, but I'd also say, "Here's how you're gifted. Here's where God's leading you. And here's the things to avoid."
That's so good. And I think that comes, like you said before, from a knowingness, right? Like it's hard for us to know when we're only focused on excellence and therefore efficiency. But when we're focused on development, which leads to discipleship,
Mm-hmm.
that only comes from a knowingness. That only
Yeah.
comes from seeing and knowing and being able to name those things
Mm-hmm.
within that child, within that young person, or even within a family at times, right? I mean, I've seen time and time again families, who don't necessarily have the vocabulary or the category, but they're like, yeah, we love having people over. It's like, yeah, that's called the gift of hospitality. You
Mm-hmm.
should do that. And you
Yeah.
should invite people over and you're good
100%.
at it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have an Instagram worthy house, but you just have to have a welcoming house and an open front door and people will just go there. And I think, man, if we can start working with kids in that regard, Sam, if we can start welcoming them into imperfect, probably, a lot of failure at the beginning, but development,
Mm-hmm.
that just seems like such a sure or at least clearer pathway to develop them as disciples rather
Yeah.
than just expect them to be excellent in terms of like, skills, aptitudes, and abilities from the get-go.
Well, and I think this goes. It is with kids, but I think it's also with volunteers. I think with volunteers, sometimes we're looking just to fill spaces, so we just plug people in without saying, without praying about or talking with this volunteer and seeing how God's uniquely gifted them and putting them in the place where they would flourish. We put them in a place of our need rather than a place of God's design. And it's really important for us to make sure that we steward their gifts well. And it's also important that we don't just allow like the greatest storyteller ever to only be the only person that ever tells the Bible story. But that if that person is really that good, what we do is we invite people alongside them to watch, observe, to grow, and to reproduce what that person is. And when you have someone who's uniquely gifted in that way, it's very easy for us to set it and forget it. We just let them go and leave it, instead of bringing people into their orbit that they can mentor, train, develop, and release into ministry. And I think that's I think, to me, the goal of excellence. The goal of excellence isn't this polished production. It's to bring people into our orbit in such a way that we can release them and create lesser quality things that grow into excellent things.
That's really good, Sam. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. It was great talking with you on this, Sam. I think it's a really pertinent and real thing for us to wrestle through in terms of our ministries. Let's not be so addicted to excellence that we avoid authenticity, but let's also find the balance and not be, so relationally driven that we're not allowing space for, you know, kids to have fun. We want church
Hmm.
to be a place that kids
Totally.
want to be at, young people to be at, families to be at.
Hmm.
And that doesn't happen just from great preaching or great, worship. It's the entire relational fun package. So thanks for joining me today, Sam.
Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate it. It was great to be here.